Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we dig into research and pull out the key insights for you. Today we're getting into something really fundamental, how researchers actually study intimate relationships.
Yeah, the methods behind the science. We're drawing from some university-level textbook material here, really looking under the hood.
Now, I know research methods might sound a bit dry, maybe intimidating.
It can sound that way, definitely. But think about it. Our relationships are so central to our lives. If we want to understand them properly, beyond just, advice columns or what our friends say,
Right.
we need solid methods. We need ways to know what's actually backed by evidence versus what's just someone's opinion. That's what this is all about.
Exactly. We get bombarded with tips and tricks everywhere. Understanding how scientists study this stuff, it gives you the tools to be critical, to ask, okay, but how do they know that?
It helps you sort the reliable findings from, well, the noise, which is super important for something this personal.
So in this deep dive, we're going to walk through that whole process. We'll touch on the history, how this field even got started.
It's younger than you might think. Then we'll look at how researchers come up with their questions in the first place.
And how they find people for their studies, the participants.
Yeah, who gets studied matters.
Yeah.
And then the different research designs they use, correlational, experimental.
We'll break those down. And the kinds of data they collect, asking people questions, watching them interact.
Even looking at physiological stuff like heart rate or analyzing existing records.
And, importantly, the ethics involved. How do they study sensitive topics responsibly?
Crucial point. Finally, we'll talk about interpreting the results. What does it all mean? We've got some really cool examples to illustrate everything.
Great. So where do we start? History.
Let's start there. It gives context. You think about fields like physics, chemistry, biology, centuries of development, right?
Yeah, long established.
The systematic study of relationships, it's much, much younger. Really only got going properly in the mid-20th century.
Wow. So before that, it was mostly philosophers, poets.
Exactly. Thinkers, artists offering really profound insights, no doubt. But based on their own reflections, their observations, not really empirical, not systematically tested.
Just insightful opinions, essentially.
Right. So the first baby steps towards empirical study were maybe in the 1930s. Some work looking at kids' friendships, courtship, marriage patterns.
Okay, so people started actually observing and recording things.
And then after World War II, you had some influential field studies looking at social groups on street corners or how friendships formed in university housing.
Studying people in their natural habitats, so to speak.
Kind of, yeah. But even by the late 1950s, there wasn't really a cohesive science of relationships. It wasn't a big focus, even within psychology. One president of the APA actually noted the lack of attention to things like love.
That is surprising. You'd think love and connection would be central to psychology.
You would. But things really took off in the 60s and 70s. A big surge in research, especially from social psychologists, they really emphasized lab experiments.
The controlled environment. Studying attraction, love.
Exactly. Trying to isolate specific factors. A classic example is work on attitude similarity. Does liking someone depend on how similar their attitudes are to yours?
How do they test that in a lab?
Well, they'd give participants information about a supposed stranger, maybe their answers to a questionnaire, but the researchers controlled how similar or dissimilar those answers were to the participants' own views.
Clever. So the participant thinks they're reading about a real person.
But the similarity level is manipulated. And consistently, they found that more perceived similarity led to more liking, even without any real interaction.
Just based on the information.
Yep. It showed that specific variables could be isolated and measured, that they had a predictable effect.
That must have been huge for establishing the field as, a legitimate science.
Absolutely. It demonstrated that relationships weren't just random or mystical, but had underlying principles you could study.
It brought rigor.
It did. But of course, there were limitations. Those early lab studies, while powerful for control, were often artificial.
Right. Liking someone based on a questionnaire isn't quite the same as falling for someone you meet.
Exactly. You lose the complexity, the nonverbal cues, the spontaneity of real interaction. So those studies were foundational, but they gave a somewhat narrow view.
But they opened the door.
They absolutely did. And since then, the field has exploded. It's much broader now. It draws from sociology, family studies, communication, neuroscience.
And the research itself looks different now, right? More diverse.
Hugely different. Researchers study all sorts of relationships, friendships, family, work, not just romance. They look at diverse samples from around the world.
Not just university students anymore.
Hopefully not just university students, and there's a big focus on longitudinal studies.
Following the same people over time.
Yes, tracking how relationships change, what predicts long-term success or failure, and they studied the good and the bad conflict, problems, not just the happy stuff.
And getting out of the lab more.
Definitely. Studying people in natural settings, technology has been a massive enabler there.
Okay, give us some examples of these modern methods. You mentioned speed dating.
Yeah, researchers set up speed dating events. They can record people's immediate reactions, see who they choose, analyze their brief interactions, what predicts that initial spark.
Fascinating. What else?
There's work where researchers discreetly record conversations between people who've just met. Later, with consent, participants listen back and report their thoughts and feelings moment by moment.
Wow, like getting inside their heads during the interaction.
Kind of. It reveals those internal perceptions. Then you have virtual reality studies.
How does VR fit in?
Researchers can create virtual interactions and precisely manipulate things like an avatar's facial expression, maybe making it smile slightly more, and see how that affects the participant's experience.
So you can test subtle cues you couldn't control in real life.
Exactly. And then there's the AA, the electronically activated recorder. It's a small device people wear.
Like a bug.
Sort of, but ethically. It briefly records snippets of sound throughout their day. It gives researchers a sample of their real-world conversations, their social environment, without being too intrusive.
A direct measure of daily social life.
Mm-hmm. And think about the work with married couples discussing disagreements. They're videotaped, their physiological responses are measured heart rate, things like that.
That's the Gottman Institute stuff, right? Where they can predict divorce.
That kind of research, yes. Analyzing communication patterns and physiological reactions together yields powerful predictions about relationship trajectories.
Incredible. And brain imaging.
Yep, fMRI studies. Looking at brain activity when people view pictures of their long-term spouse versus, say, a friend, mapping the neural basis of love and attachment.
So we're looking at behavior, self-perception, physiology, and brain activity.
We are. Plus, there are huge longitudinal projects like PairFam in Germany, tracking thousands of people, individuals, partners, parents, kids over many years.
That must generate enormous amounts of data on how relationships unfold.
It does. Or the Early Years of Marriage project in the U.S., following couples since 1986, looking at how things like socioeconomic stress impact marriage, especially comparing different racial groups.
So it's really gone from those simple lab studies to this incredibly diverse, multi-method field.
Absolutely. Researchers are using all sorts of creative, resourceful methods. It's a vibrant area of science now.
Okay, so that's the landscape. But let's rewind. How does a study even begin? It starts with a question, right?
Always. It starts with a question. And these questions can come from anywhere, really.
Like personal experience.
Definitely. A researcher might observe something in their own life or someone else's and think, I wonder why that happens. Or maybe they see a broader social problem.
Like rising divorce rates or maybe online dating trends.
Exactly. Social issues often drive research. And of course, previous research is a huge source. One study's findings often raise new questions.
So science builds on itself.
It does. And theories play a big role, too. A theory about attachment, say, might predict certain behaviors in romantic relationships, and researchers design studies to test those predictions.
So it's a mix of observations, social concern, existing knowledge, and theory.
Pretty much. Researchers integrate all of that. And the questions they ask tend to fall into two main types.
What are?
Descriptive questions and causal questions.
Okay, descriptive.
Descriptive research just aims to describe what's happening. What are the common communication styles? How often do couples argue about money? The goal is to paint an accurate picture of things as they naturally occur.
Just mapping the territory.
Exactly. Causal research, on the other hand, wants to know why. It tries to figure out if one thing causes another. Does using I statements during conflict cause better resolution?
Cause and effect.
Right. And it's really, really important to keep these two types separate. You can't automatically jump from a description of a pattern to a conclusion about what's causing it.
We'll come back to that with correlation, I bet.
We definitely will. It's a common trap.
Okay, so you have your question. Next step. Find people to study. Participants. How does that work?
Well, there are two main strategies here: convenient samples and representative samples.
Convenient sounds convenient.
It is. It means recruiting people who are easy to get. University students are the classic example. They're right there. Maybe they participate for course credit. It's practical.
But the downside?
The big downside is generalizability. Can you really say that what you found in a group of 19-year-old psych students applies to, say, married couples in their 50s? Probably not always.
So the findings might be limited to that specific group?
They might be. The alternative is a representative sample.
That sounds better. What makes it representative?
The goal is to get a group of participants whose characteristics mirror the larger population you're interested in. If you're studying marriage in the U.S., you want your sample to reflect the whole country in terms of age, ethnicity, income, location, etc.
That sounds much harder to pull off.
Oh, it's way harder, more expensive, more time-consuming. And even with the best intentions, researchers run into something called volunteer bias.
Volunteer bias, meaning the people who agree to be in the study might be different from those who don't.
Exactly that. Think about studies on sexuality. People who volunteer for those tend to be more sexually experienced, maybe hold more liberal views than people who decline.
Okay, I see.
Or studies on couples. Maybe the couples who volunteer are happier on average, or maybe they're the ones having problems and looking for insights. Either way, they might not be typical of all couples.
So the sample gets skewed just by who chooses to participate.
Right. It can definitely introduce bias. Remember that classic study where students were approached on campus and asked for a date or to go back to their apartment or for sex?
Yes, the one with the big gender difference in answers.
That one. It used a convenience sample students at one university. And initially, people rightly question, okay, does this really apply broadly?
Yeah, you'd wonder.
But what's interesting is that later research, using much bigger, more diverse samples, different ages, different cultures, largely found the same basic pattern. Men are generally more likely than women to accept casual sex offers from strangers.
So the initial finding, even from a limited sample, held up.
Broadly, yes. The specific numbers might change, but the core difference seems pretty robust. It shows that sometimes, even convenient samples can tap into fundamental patterns, but it also shows why replication is so important.
Repeating studies with different groups.
Exactly. Confidence comes from seeing findings emerge again and again, using different methods, different people. No single study is perfect.
Okay, that makes sense. So, question, participants.
Yeah.
Now the plan. The rear-ish design.
Right, the design is the blueprint for how you'll arrange your observations to answer your question. Two main types again, correlational and experimental.
Correlational first. What's the idea there?
Correlational designs look for associations. They measure two or more things and see if they tend to go together. Does change in one thing correspond with change in another?
Like, do people who communicate more have happier relationships?
That's a perfect example. You'd measure communication frequency and relationship satisfaction and see if they're related. A positive correlation means they move in the same direction, more communication, more satisfaction, or less communication, less satisfaction.
And negative correlation.
They move in opposite directions, like maybe more conflict is associated with less satisfaction. As conflict goes up, satisfaction goes down.
Got it. And sometimes things just aren't related.
Right, they're uncorrelated. Knowing one tells you nothing about the other. Now, here's the big caution we mentioned earlier.
Correlation does not equal causation.
Say it loud. Just because two things are correlated doesn't mean one causes the other.
Let's use that similarity and liking example again. They're positively correlated.
Yeah.
Why doesn't that prove similarity causes liking?
Because there are other possibilities. Yes, similarity might cause liking. But maybe liking someone causes you to perceive them as more similar. You focus on the common ground.
Okay, reverse causality.
Right. Or maybe there's a third variable involved. Maybe people who are generally optimistic tend to both like others more easily and perceive more similarity. The optimism is causing both.
Ah, the hidden variable.
Exactly. So a simple correlation just shows a link. It doesn't explain the reason for the link. Though sophisticated statistics with multiple variables or data over time can sometimes help narrow down the possibilities.
Okay, so if correlation can't prove cause and effect, how do researchers test that?
That's where experiments come in. Experiments are designed specifically to nail down causality.
Because the researcher takes control.
Precisely. They manipulate something, the suspected cause, that's the independent variable, and see what effect it has on an outcome, dependent variable, while trying to keep everything else constant.
And the key is manipulation and random assignment.
Yes. Random assignment is critical. You randomly assign participants to different conditions, different levels of the independent variable. This helps ensure the groups start out roughly equivalent on average. Any differences you see after the manipulation are more likely due to the manipulation itself.
Let's go back to the attitude similarity experiment. How did random assignment work there?
Okay, so participants came in, they were randomly put into either the high similarity group, getting a stranger's profile that matched their attitudes, or the low similarity group, getting a profile that didn't match.
So chance determined which group they were in.
Right, which means on average, the two groups should be similar in terms of personality, mood, anything else before they saw the profile. So when the high similarity group consistently reported more liking,
You could be pretty confident it was the similarity that caused it.
exactly, that's the power of the experimental design for showing cause and effect.
But experiments have limits too, right?
Yeah.
You said we can't ethically manipulate everything in relationships.
That's the major limitation. You can't experimentally assign people to fall in love or to experience a breakup or to have a supportive versus unsupportive partner for years. It's often impractical or unethical.
So you need both types of design.
Definitely. Correlational studies are great for exploring naturally occurring relationships and variables you can't manipulate. Experiments are great for testing specific causal hypotheses when you can manipulate things. They complement each other.
Okay, design chosen. Now, what kind of data do they actually collect? You mentioned self-reports and observations.
Those are the two big ones, yeah. Self-reports are just asking people directly about themselves, their thoughts, feelings, behaviors.
Through questionnaires,
Yeah.
interviews, diaries maybe?
All of the above.
Yeah.
The information comes straight from the source, the participant. The big advantage is you get access to their inner world, things you can't directly see. And often, it's relatively easy and cheap to collect, especially surveys.
Like that relationship flourishing scale you mentioned. Quick questions, lots of info.
Yeah, exactly. Very efficient. But self-reports have pitfalls. One is interpretation. Do participants understand the question the way the researcher intended? How often do you have sex? Means different things to different people.
Right. Definitions matter. What else?
Recall and awareness. People might genuinely not remember things accurately, or they might not even be aware of their own motivations or how they actually behave. Think about stated versus actual preferences in mate choice. Sometimes there's a disconnect.
Our memories aren't perfect video recorders.
Far from it. Especially for past feelings or events, memory can be distorted by our current mood or situation. And then there's bias.
People not being entirely honest.
Sometimes it's called social desirability bias. We want to look good, so people might underreport things like infidelity or drug use or arguments.
They paint a rosier picture.
They might. Or they might overreport positive things. We saw that with the lie detector example. People sometimes report more sexual partners when they think they might be caught lying.
So researchers have to worry about accuracy and honesty with self-reports. How do they combat that?
Assuring anonymity helps a lot. Using neutral question wording. Sometimes using indirect measures. Online surveys might feel less pressured than face-to-face interviews for some topics.
Okay, so self-reports are useful but imperfect. What about observations?
Observations involve watching and recording behavior directly. Could be in a lab, watching a couple interact, maybe using a specific coding system, or it could be more naturalistic.
Like the ear device you mentioned, capturing sounds in daily life.
Exactly. That's a type of ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, getting snapshots of behavior in real time in the real world. Smartphone apps are also used for this now, tracking location, communication, with permission, of course.
And you mentioned eye tracking too.
Yep. Technology lets us observe very specific things, like exactly where someone looks during an interaction, what captures their visual attention.
The big advantage here is you're seeing actual behavior, not just what people say they do.
Right. It bypasses some of the self-report biases, like faulty memory or social desirability, but observations have their own challenges.
Like cost.
Cost is a big one. Equipment, training observers, hours spent, coding, video or audio can be very resource intensive. And then there's reactivity.
People changing their behavior because they know they're being watched.
Exactly. The mere presence of a camera or an observer might make people act differently than they normally would. Researchers try to minimize this, maybe by observing unobtrusively or letting people get used to being observed first.
Like that Facebook study you mentioned, analyzing profiles, without users knowing they were part of that specific study. That avoids reactivity.
It does, but it raises ethical questions about privacy and consent, doesn't it?
Definitely a tricky balance there.
Yeah.
Okay, so self-reports, observations, any other data types?
Yes, physiological measures are increasingly common. Looking at the body's responses, heart rate, blood pressure, hormone levels like cortisol or oxytocin, brain activity via fMRI.
Connecting the physical and the social, like higher oxytocin in satisfied couples.
Precisely. Or mapping brain areas linked to long-term attachment. These measures tap into biological processes that underlie our social experiences, often things outside our conscious awareness. They're powerful, but also tend to be expensive and require specialized expertise.
And the last one, archival materials.
Right. This means using existing data that wasn't collected for the current study. Think personal letters, diaries, photos, public records like marriage licenses or census data, even social media posts.
The yearbook photo study predicting divorce is a great example.
It is. The beauty of archives is they are non-reactive. The data existed before the researcher came along. They can also allow for historical comparisons. The downside is the existing data might not be exactly what the researcher needs or might lack important details.
So researchers have this whole toolkit of data collection methods, each with pros and cons.
And often the strongest research uses multiple methods to get a more complete picture.
Now, this all sounds fascinating, but relationship research touches on really personal stuff. What about the ethics?
Ethics are absolutely critical. Researchers have a huge responsibility to protect the well-being of participants. Even simple questionnaires can sometimes make people evaluate their relationship in ways they hadn't before, which could potentially cause distress.
Like asking detailed questions about satisfaction might make someone realize they aren't very satisfied.
It could. And think about procedures like asking couples to rehash arguments in the lab. While scientifically valuable, could it actually harm the relationship for some couples? It's a serious question researchers grapple with.
So what are the safeguards?
Standard practice involves several key things. Informed consent is paramount. Participants must understand what the study involves, the risks and benefits, and that they can withdraw any time without penalty. Participation has to be voluntary.
No coercion.
None. And after the study, there's usually debriefing, explaining the study's true purpose, especially if any deception was used. And often, particularly with sensitive topics, researchers provide resources, like contact info for counseling services.
The source material had that interesting point to ponder. Should we even study difficult topics like infidelity or abuse? Would you participate?
It's a really tough question. These topics are painful. Researching them involves risks. But the counter-argument is strong, too. How can we help people or prevent harm if we don't understand these issues? Ignorance can be harmful, too.
Like the example of marriage education programs for low-income families, sometimes failing because they didn't address the core issue, which might have been financial stress, not just communication skills.
Exactly. Without good research into the real problems, interventions might miss the mark. So there's an ethical imperative to gain knowledge that can ultimately reduce suffering and increase well-being, even when studying difficult subjects.
It's a justification for the research itself.
In many ways, yes. Trying to understand relationships better to help people navigate them more successfully.
Okay, so data is collected ethically. Now, how do researchers make sense of it all? Interpreting results.
This usually involves statistics. Researchers use statistical tests to see if their findings are statistically significant. Meaning, it's unlikely the results happened just by random chance. There's a low probability the pattern they observed is a fluke. The findings reported in our source material are all considered statistically significant.
But significant doesn't mean absolutely proven or even practically important, right?
Excellent point.
Yeah.
It doesn't guarantee truth. There's still a small chance it was random chance. Or maybe the finding only applies to that specific group studied. A result from college students might look different in a broader adult sample.
Which brings us back to replication.
Yes. Repeating studies is crucial. If different researchers with different samples find the same thing, our confidence goes way up. Failures to replicate happen too, and that's also important. It helps refine our understanding and shows the science is self-correcting.
And that's related to open science.
It is. Open science practices, sharing materials, data, procedures, make it easier for others to replicate, verify, or build upon research. It promotes transparency and rigor. The field is generally moving towards larger samples and more detailed reporting too.
Another key thing, research describes group patterns, not individuals necessarily.
Hugely important. Findings are about averages, tendencies. Don't dismiss a general finding just because your own experience or your cousin's experience is different. Research identifies probabilities, not destiny for any one person.
Are there unique statistical challenges in relationship research?
Yes, a couple of big ones. First, data from partners is interdependent. My satisfaction is probably linked to my partner's satisfaction. They aren't independent data points.
So you can't just treat them separately in the stats.
Right, you need special statistical techniques that account for that pairing. Second, relationship outcomes are influenced by three things: partner A's traits, partner B's traits, and the unique dynamic between A and B. Analyzing those three sources of influence simultaneously is complex.
So it requires sophisticated analysis.
It often does. The overall message: be a thoughtful consumer. Understand the complexity. Trust patterns found consistently across different studies and methods more than any single result.
And that's where meta-analysis comes in.
Exactly. Meta-analysis statistically combines results from many prior studies on the same topic. It gives a bigger picture view, identifies common themes, and can resolve discrepancies between individual studies. It's a very powerful tool.
So despite being young and complex, relationship science is actually in pretty good shape.
It really is. It's made huge progress. The information we have now is generally dependable, and much of it is based on relatively recent discoveries.
And that final point to ponder is interesting too, checking our own reactions to surprising findings. Where does that gut feeling of no way or how cool come from? Being aware of our own biases.
Always a good practice. Okay, shall we quickly summarize the key takeaways from all this?
Let's do it. First, the key terms we covered.
Right. There was convenient sample easily available participants, like students.
And representative sample participants who mirror the whole population of interest.
Volunteer bias, how those who participate might differ from those who don't.
Correlations patterns, where changes in one thing go along with changes in another. But remember,
Correlation doesn't equal causation. Then experiments where researchers manipulate something to see its effect using random assignment,
self-reports getting data directly from people about themselves.
which can be affected by social desirability bias wanting to look good.
Ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, collecting brief data samples in real time, in real life.
Which aims to reduce reactivity to people changing behavior because they're observed.
Archives using existing data, like records or documents.
Open science sharing research materials and data.
And finally, meta-analyses, studies that combine results from many previous studies.
Good recap. Now the main points from the chapter summary.
Okay. Relationship science is young but growing fast, studying all kinds of relationships globally.
Research questions come from experience, social issues, prior research, and theory, asking either what's happening, descriptive, or why, causal.
Samples can be convenient, easy, less generalizable, or representative, harder, more generalizable, and both face volunteer bias.
Correlational designs show associations, not cause and effect.
Experimental designs test cause and effect through manipulation and random assignment, but aren't always feasible or ethical.
Self-reports give internal perspectives but have issues with memory, interpretation, and bias.
Observations capture behavior directly, but can be costly and prone to reactivity. Physiological measures look at biological links. Archives use existing non-reactive data.
Ethics are vital. Informed consent, voluntary participation, protecting participants is key.
Statistical significance suggests results aren't likely due to chance, but replication and meta-analysis build confidence.
And overall, despite challenges, relationship science is a robust field, providing valuable insights.
Perfect. Lastly, the suggestions for satisfaction from this chapter.
Two main ones here. First, don't just accept any relationship advice you hear. Use your understanding of these methods to judge credibility.
Be a critical consumer.
Exactly. And second, always remember that correlation is ambiguous. Just because two things are linked doesn't mean one caused the other. There could be multiple explanations.
Great advice. So really, knowing about these methods helps us navigate the world of relationship information much more effectively.
That's the core message. It empowers you to understand what's solid evidence and what's just noise.
It's complex stuff, but so relevant to our everyday lives.
We hope this dive has given you a clear picture of how this science actually works.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Considering all these different methods, observations, surveys, physiology, VR, big data, and how fast things are changing, what do you think the next big breakthrough in how we study human connection might look like?
Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.